Welcome, everybody, to our next session today. I know a lot of you just enjoyed hosting with Chip and Paul, but next we are going to move on to media. So we're moving from business to media, and with me here today, I've got James Dell, who is the head of media at Singularity University and the publisher of Singularity Hub and Futurism.com. If you don't actively subscribe to either one of those sites, highly recommend them, especially the cartoons that Futurism makes available. Both are news sites dedicated to futuristic science and technology. He spent the last 12 years working in and around media and advertising and studied intellectual property at in the digital age at NYU's Gallatin School of Individualized Study, which maybe is a topic for another day and how you kind of build your own degree, which is super rad. But thanks for joining us. Looking forward to the topic. I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks, Adam. Always a pleasure to see you. Hello, everyone. Thanks for coming to my chat. We're talking about fake news and media's role in a global emergency. Now, everyone here, I assume, is consuming some form of media. That's probably how you found out about this thing. And I, as Adam said, spent the last 12 years working in media and watching kind of the rise of social platforms and fake news. And so I feel like I've never seen a story like the story that we're currently living right now. Not at least not from being inside of a news publication or a newsroom. But I've seen a lot and I've learned a lot. And so I hope I could share some things. We'll talk a little bit about just kind of media and journalism in general for those of you who maybe aren't as familiar with how this industry works. We'll get into kind of how fake news works and where all of the fake news comes from and how it disseminates. And then I'll kind of share some tips and tricks, especially as it relates to COVID-19, where you should be looking for information and all those good things. So as Adam said, please like and follow Futurism. I'll remind you again at the end, as well as Singularity Hub. And if you have questions, leave them in the comments or in the question box. All right, so some of you may have heard this term before, but in a functioning democracy, the media is considered the fourth estate. This actually goes back to kind of Victorian era, back when the Parliament in the UK had a House of Lords, they had the House of Commons, and they had the Sovereign. So there were three estates that were kind of running the country. But it was kind of recognized that there was actually a fourth estate, in my eyes, one of the most important estates, and a view shared by Thomas Jefferson, as you can see with this quote here. And the fourth estate was the press. The press's role as a member of, democratic societies is to share information. Sometimes that information is just, simple stuff, sports stats and school closings, things like that. Other times it's information that people in power don't necessarily want out and about. At the end of the day, the reason it is the fourth estate, though, is because a functioning democracy requires an informed electorate and an informed public. And so the press, especially journalists at esteemed publications, which we'll get into in a little bit, they take this role very seriously. It is a public service to work in journalism in a lot of ways. And so, most journalists are never going to be rich and famous. You may see some on TV who have made it that far, or one writes a book that turns into a movie, but for the most part, journalism is a calling, and it's something that people who take it seriously, take it very seriously. There are 5 tenets you should know about and think about when you are reading these more prestigious publications you've heard of, or networks that have esteem. These are not regulated by some governing body of journalists or anything like that. This is kind of a code of ethics that goes back all the way to the beginning of journalism, that all serious journalists try to follow these days. The first is honesty. Obviously, fact is above all else the most important thing when it comes to reporting out the news. We'll get into fake news plenty in a bit, but real journalists do take their work seriously when it comes to making sure that the truth is exposed. That is a guiding principle for most journalists that I know. Independence and objectivity. This one, a little hard to put your finger on. Objectivity is a hard state of mind to get yourself into, but the goal for most journalists is to remove themselves from the story. So any personal bias that they may have shouldn't impact how they write about a story. If some of you read financial publications, for example, you may notice at the bottom of some of those articles, there's a disclaimer that says that the author of the article doesn't own any stock in the companies that they were just talking about. The reason they say that is because they need to show that they're being objective and they are independent. They are not telling you this information because they want to, skew the market in one way and make a bunch of money. They're saying it because they want you to know the information, and there is no other gain for them in that regard. Next is fairness, which is another tough one. Fairness doesn't always mean balance, and that's a long conversation for probably another time. But fairness means trying to get all the facts that one can, and really not just tell a one-sided story, but dig around and make sure that all viewpoints that the public may be interested in are somewhere represented, even if they may exist on the fringe. It is still important for people to understand, global warming or climate change is a great example of how fairness is kind of a sticky subject. Do you say that people deny climate change because 1% of scientists have questions about it? It's a good question, but journalists are constantly thinking that way and asking themselves, am I representing all sides? Is this a fair story as I'm publishing it? There's diligence, which in today's news cycle, which moves at 1,000,000 miles a second, it feels like, it's easy to kind of forget that a lot of work and research goes into the stories that reporters publish. You'll seldom see a major publication run a single sourced story. That means having only one person as the source for that information. They'll often need to find 2, 3, 4, the more the better, in order to corroborate a story. And that requires knowing who to call. It requires knowing what biases may exist in the sources that a particular reporter may be talking to, so that he or she can kind of suss out, am I getting real information here? Or am I getting a spin that I don't want to pass on to my readers? How can I be diligent about this? And finally, accountability. I think perhaps one of the most important pieces of being a journalist. All journalists with any reputation will put their name on their work. They will be, easily contactable through email or through social networks. They will have a body of work that follows them around. A journalist's reputation is truly everything in this industry. If their reputation suffers, they will have a very hard time getting a reputable job at any other publication. And so it's important that if someone gets a story wrong, which happens sometimes, the information's incomplete or you were fed bad information. There are a million ways to get a story wrong. But all good journalists, when they get a story wrong, will not double down and say, no, you're wrong, here's why I'm right. They will acknowledge when they make a mistake. They'll say why they made the mistake, how they made the mistake, and they'll usually commit to doing better next time. And that's the accountability piece that kind of buttresses this entire field. Now, as I kind of mentioned earlier, there's a spectrum of coverage, and you can kind of look at this chart that I got from the University of California. And the bottom, as you can imagine, kind of goes from liberal fringe on one side to conservative fringe on the other side. And you'll see that on the vertical axis, it goes from sensational / clickbait all the way up to complex analytical coverage. The publications you're probably most familiar with sit in the middle. Those are your APs, your Reuters, your AFP, your CNNs, New York Times, Wall Street Journal. And, there is always going to be some sway one way or another way. Different writers cover stories differently for different publications. Different networks obviously cover stories differently. But Everything that is kind of in that middle there is what I would consider, and what most people consider, to be the mainstream media. And if you look at this kind of chart of different media publications, ranging from sites that you've definitely heard of, like the New York Times or the Washington Post, all the way down to sites that you haven't heard of that are so small that you probably can't even read them here. It is a bustling ecosystem. There are thousands upon thousands of different mainstream publications all over the world. And the nice thing is they kind of self-police one another. So, if Fox News is spreading misinformation for some reason, you can expect to hear about it in any number of these other publications debunking that story for whatever reason. And it goes both ways. It's, everyone here is kind of a frenemy in this field. So the journalists all speak to one another, the publishers all speak to one another. But I wouldn't call that a media cabal. It is more of, the kind of friendly competition one would normally see in any industry. I'm sure your own industries have these kinds of working groups as well. Now, the problem, though, is, these are mostly mainstream publications, some fringe publications as well, but we don't exist in a clean world anymore where there are 4 TV networks and, 8 different magazines and, a handful of daily newspapers in all the major cities. We have literally millions of people creating content on the internet. The internet has been a great democratizing force that has allowed for anyone to, spin up a blog or start sharing their thoughts or ideas, for no cost. It used to be wildly expensive if you wanted to run a media publication. You had to get a printing press or a satellite for broadcast, or any number of expensive things that one would need to run a traditional publication. Those costs have effectively dropped to zero now, and so anyone can create something. Pro is you can get some really interesting stories that you wouldn't have been able to find otherwise on the fringe out there. The other side is you could have people who are trying to either make a buck or influence some kind of geopolitical outcome, or just being stupid and satirical, sharing information as if it's fact. And so it's really important for those dots you kind of see in the middle of this chart to act as the gatekeepers of the media and of the kind of the public discourse, if you will. It used to work a lot better when there weren't as many nodes, and now it's totally possible for fake news to spread in a corner of the internet, and it never even hits the radar of a Politico or a CNN. But it's important that we recognize that if you're hearing it from mainstream publications, there's been a lot of diligence that has gone into making sure the facts there are right. And if you're not hearing it from those major publications, you need to be wary. It's wary. Sorry, it's been a long day, and this is the first time I've been out of my apartment in about 8 days, so bear with me here. Little fun clip here just to give you an example of the kind of stupid stuff that exists in the fringe. Now, what I'm about to show you is not meant to be taken as serious advice, not that I would expect anyone in this group to think it is, especially after all the great speakers we've had all week. That being said, this video has been seen probably hundreds of thousands of times, if not more, and having met lots and lots of people, I'm sure there was at least 1 or 2 who thought this was serious for a second. So this is just fun. I really just wanted to share a TikTok with you guys because I wasn't going to get an opportunity to do it otherwise. So please enjoy. Yeah. So, I mean, obviously, most people would not take that seriously as, a way to protect yourself from the coronavirus. But perhaps a young child could, or a kid, a 13-year-old child on TikTok could see that and try it themselves and hurt themselves. You would never see that in the New York Times is kind of the point I'm trying to make there. You've probably seen these boxes on the internet. In media, we call these chum boxes. They are filled with clickbait. And clickbait is good business. There is a really clean arbitrage play where I could pay, as little as a penny or less than a penny to get people to click on articles if I use some kind of sensationalist headline or something that's titillating, perhaps, or shocking in some way, shape, or form. The problem with them is they're just ways for hucksters basically to make money by driving traffic. So someone pays a half a cent to get you to click on the story about the camera found in the iceberg that sank the Titanic with film still in it. But then you look at the photo and you see it's a photo from the Leonardo DiCaprio film Titanic. We'd like to believe that people aren't as stupid to believe that that's not a real photo from the Titanic, but yet people click on it. And there's a lot of money to be made creating that kind of content that's not real. And so it's still proliferating. I will say this is a Taboola unit, and they have done a fairly good job trying to clean this up, but it is not perfect still. And these units still exist all over the internet. And one last thing, if you look at some of the titles of the sites that these articles are coming from, they sound kind of real. So historicalpast.com sounds like a site that would cover history. It's clearly not, but you may not know that had you not thought about it. The platforms were caught particularly flat-footed when it came to fake news in 2016. I won't relitigate the 2016 election here in the US, but it's clear that it's affecting all over the world. The story on the left here from the Rockdale Herald, this was captured a couple days after the 2016 election. You'll notice it talks about Prime Minister Trudeau building a wall. It's the Rockdale Herald, if you didn't know, is kind of like The Onion. It is a satire website. And so, it's meant to be a joke, but if you're just scrolling through your news feed, which all of us do at some point, we see a headline, it's not hard for us to click share or, read the headline but not read the article and think that information is somehow true because it looks like it's coming from a publication that has Herald in the title. It sounds real. On the right, you can see this was a Google search result done by the Scholarly Kitchen shortly after the 2016 election. The Google search was for final election count. You'll see the top story there proclaims that Trump won both the popular and electoral college. That is not true. You can see that there is, the source is a little questionable, 70 News at WordPress.com. Doesn't sound very, noteworthy, but it doesn't sound not noteworthy. No major red flags there. The story at the bottom is just a great bit of meta trolling. You'll see that there's a Mediaite piece that actually calls Google out for aiding the scourge of fake news around the election. And so I will say all platforms have gotten better at this. They understand that this is a major problem. For a long time, they thought as tech companies, they should try to solve these problems with technology. But this is a very human problem, and technology has not proven totally useful in being able to tell the difference between real and fake news. It has gotten a lot better. But finally, Facebook and Google and Twitter have started talking to and employing journalists on staff, not for them to read all the stories and decide what's true or not, but to at least help their engineers think about how they can solve this problem with the technology that they have. And so now satire articles on Facebook get a little button on them, and Google has gotten way more cracked down about the publications they'll source in their news units. And so we're making progress, but we're still not all the way there. This is not a new problem. This is an article that's been kind of circulating around the last couple of weeks. You can see it says Spanish influenza, a new name for the same old familiar disease. Simply the same old grip that has swept over the world time and time again, blah, 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 blah. It probably sounds familiar to some of the early COVID-19 coverage that we saw here in the United States, and probably in other places around the world. What you may not know about this article, though, because it's kind of clipped off, is it's actually part of a Vicks VapoRub branded content campaign that was running in major newspapers all over the country in 1918. There were 6 different articles that they ran over the course of the year, and it worked so well, and they sold so much Vicks VapoRub that they had to increase production, and there was a Vicks shortage at one point because they were making claims like Vicks could help you treat Spanish influenza. Now, the FDA was, fun fact, created in 1908 to kind of protect against me making some potion in my garage and slapping a Vicks logo on it. But in 1930, it wasn't until 1938 that the FDA started banning, medical claims or treatment claims within medical advertisements. And so this was a good 20 years before that. But I wanted to share these to kind of illustrate that, as I said earlier, there's financial gain to be had with fake news. And this is not a new concept. This is something that literally has been around for over 100 years, likely much longer. Let's, jump into the present. This is a text message that was going around in New York City, but actually all over the country last week, around Thursday, Friday. I actually received it, or a version of it, from a friend of mine who was relaying similar information. It's obviously not true. I'm in New York City, and I can confirm that we have not shut down Metro North. We have not limited the subway service. We are still all open. But late last week, we didn't know it was going to happen. And so these kinds of text messages that get passed along are scary, and they can lead to panic, and they can lead to, civil discord. And that, is someone who cares about using information to calm the general public, is a scary prospect. And there are a ton of red flags in here. I mean, the biggest red flag, if you see something like this come through, is the number of sources away from the original point that this is. So if you read it, this is, assume I'm the one getting this text message. My friend is sending me something that their friend's friend sent them, and they said that their friend has a friend who alerted me that their friend works in the emergency management team at the NYPD. That's 6 different, that's Kevin Bacon degrees removed from the supposed source of this information. And that is not a good sign. Anything that starts like that, where it's a friend of a friend, or I heard something from someone who heard something from someone, are typically not reliable sources. As I said earlier, if I were a newspaper trying to write a story about this, I would need several sources that I speak to directly that don't know each other in order to confirm a story like this. But over text message, there are no such controls in place. So instead, it's kind of the media's job to keep an eye out for this stuff now and self-police it the same way we would any other publication spreading fake news. And so BuzzFeed News, those of you not in the United States may think, oh my God, BuzzFeed, aren't they just clickbait and cat videos? BuzzFeed built a formidable journalism outfit a couple years ago under Ben Smith, who was at Politico for quite some time. He's now at the New York Times. And their reporters have been doing a phenomenal job of trying to keep on top of the fake news around, both with this story and other stories that exist out there. Here's another example. This one's harder. So this is a tweet that was being circulated, obviously on Twitter, that said that Daniel Radcliffe has tested positive for coronavirus. The username is at BBC News Tonight. It's got 2 BBC News logos on it. It even links to bbc.co.uk. So how is this fake news? It looks very real. Well, the reality is that's not the BBC News's username. The only way you really would have been able to tell that is if you clicked on it, you would have seen it only had maybe 100-something followers on that account. they linked to the main BBC News website so that that big red box would show up. But if you clicked on the link and looked around for a story about Daniel Radcliffe, you would have never found anything about him. It was simply a link to the BBC's news alert page. And so once again, BuzzFeed had to come out and say this is not true. But unfortunately, not before there were journalists, respected journalists like Maggie Haberman at the New York Times, who saw this tweet come through, didn't bother to go through the diligence of checking its accuracy, didn't click on it, obviously, because they would have seen there was no story there, and just retweeted it. And so, like I said earlier, while journalists typically have their the public's best intentions in mind, it is difficult at times when the news is coming in so quickly to know what is real and what is not. So you really have to be careful when you see information that seems otherwise legitimate. If you're on a social network, skepticism is healthy. Now, everything I'm talking about is kind of what exists in your democracies around the world. Not all countries are as lucky as the United States and most of Europe when it comes to a free press. Hopefully, you've all heard the story of Dr. Li Wenliang in Wuhan. If you haven't, very quickly, he was the first doctor to recognize that there was something novel about this coronavirus or new. And so as kind of a frontline doctor in a hospital, he started talking to his colleagues over WeChat, and the police came to his door 3 days later, and they told him he was spreading false information, that what he was seeing with his own two eyes as a medical professional couldn't be true, and he needed to sign an affidavit to retract what he had said under threat of imprisonment if he continued doing it. This was December 30th, January 3rd, that time range. That's a whole month before most people knew this doctor's name or knew his story. I can only wonder what the world would look like today had this doctor been listened to, if he had a press outlet that he could turn to share his story when the government said no. But unfortunately, that was not his reality, and he sadly passed away from coronavirus on February 7th, just 3 days after speaking to the New York Times in a one-on-one interview where he recounted most of the story, which is how we even really know that he exists. And to make a sad story sadder, just in the last 2 days, China has announced that major publications like the New York Times and CNN, among others, are being kicked out of the country. So our access to information that comes out of China will be harder and harder to get because in those repressive states, it is easier to control information in such a way that gives government powers the ability to hide misdeeds or corruption or any of those kinds of things than it is to allow a free press to thrive in society. We're under siege here too in the US. I don't want to spend too much time on this slide because it gives me agita, but it's important to remember that when you hear, the mainstream fake news terminology get thrown around, they're really conflating two very different things. Fake news as a term really came to prominence to kind of flag the stories that were being circulated on social media that had no basis in truth. They were being shared by bots or trolls, or in some cases, foreign entities that were seeking to sow discord. And that's what we meant when we started using the term fake news. That term has been co-opted now to mean anything that doesn't agree with our current president. And that is a backslide here in the United States. And we are not alone in watching our freedom of press rights become infringed upon by the state. I dare you to find a president or a world leader that hasn't had a problem with the press at one point or another. That's totally normal. The press will sometimes write things that work in your favor and sometimes not when you're in that kind of position. But we've never seen this level of hostility directed towards journalists or the press before. And it's alarming. So who do we trust? The doctors and medical professionals, many of which spoke here at this wonderful summit, they're going to be your best sources of information. They are on the front lines. They are not incentivized to make stuff up about this. There's no reason for them to be sensationalists. They get nothing out of it. Obviously, you still want to check your sources and you want to know, is there an ulterior motive to what I'm hearing this doctor say? But for the most part, when it comes to global pandemic type stuff, the people who know best are the people who are on the front lines and working in the healthcare system, who know exactly where they are, where they're going, and what happens next. So those are your best primary sources to listen to. Local news is also fantastic. Local news, especially for a story like this that is a global story, but it is happening in communities and in nursing homes, in schools, in cities, in towns all over the country. Local news is an often unsung hero of these stories. So, the example I've been talking about a lot lately is in Seattle. The Seattle Times has only 58 full-time reporters, but those full-time reporters know everyone in that city. They know the mayor, they know the chief of police, they know the hospital administrators. They're members of the community. They have no incentive to lie to their neighbors. They're not playing the same kind of fake news clickbait game that other larger, more fringe publications would want to play. They are servicing their community. And so by being on the front lines, they are a very good source of information that allows us to know what is happening in cities all over the world that oftentimes gets kind of upstreamed to the major broadcast networks or the major, national or international publications that exist. So local news, really great. Reputable publications and journalists, hopefully I've made the case for why the journalists at those kind of gatekeeper publications should be trusted. It is important to note that a lot of those, if not all of those publications, still have opinion writers. They still have people whose job it is to come in and say what they think. Oftentimes 1 or 2 pages away from hard news. And those opinion writers or those opinion commentators like on Fox News or MSNBC, they get a lot of airtime for being opinion, journalists. But the hard news that's being produced by those publications and those outlets is oftentimes very different than the opinion side of things. And so it's important to, if you're reading an article and it seems kind of questionable, but you're like, I'm on CNN, so like it must be true. Check to make sure it's an opinion piece. It's not an opinion piece before you go telling the world that CNN says XYZ. Most publications, I believe CNN does this, will label opinion pieces very clearly and say that this is not a reported story from the CNN editorial team. It is from the opinion team. Government agency statements and alerts, depends on your government, I guess. I have found great comfort in listening to, here in New York, listening to our governor, Andrew Cuomo, our mayor, Bill de Blasio. The local politicians, they also don't have much to gain by spreading fake news. They are there, their job is to serve the public, and they won't have that job if they let the public down. And so state agencies, federal agencies that work on this kind of thing, those are all great sources of information. And then, of course, your international organizations, they're legit, and you should listen to them. If you're ever in doubt, check multiple outlets. Look around, see if you could find the same story somewhere else. If you can't, it might be an opinion piece, it might be fake news, but with very few exceptions, any major story that we're talking about, or sharing, will get picked up by other publications, oftentimes within minutes, sometimes within an hour, sometimes within a day. Of other publications having it. That's just the nature of the news cycle and the nature of the public discourse, really. Verify information before sharing anything. So just, we've all done it. I've hit the retweet button or the share button on Facebook without fully reading an article. That's bad. Doesn't matter how legit it may seem, how much you agree with the sentiment. that piece may have, you should really, click around, verify it. Who's the author? If it seems suspect, it might be suspect. So, a handful of Google searches into, who is the author of this piece? What publication is this coming from? Who's sharing it to me? And, what ends could be accomplished by me sharing it? Those are all great questions to ask yourself before you hit that share button. I kind of mentioned it before, so I won't dwell on it, but you want to interrogate the source. If it's a friend of a friend of a friend, that is not a good source. A source is someone that has firsthand information. Everything else is hearsay. Generally, be skeptical. If I haven't driven that point home yet, I'll say it again: be skeptical. There's a lot of this news out there, and as I've hopefully shown, it's sophisticated. It is not simply a kid turning a doorknob with his mouth. And so having that healthy dose of skepticism as you consume information will make sure that the information you're getting is the information you can use and not the useless stuff. Educate your friends and family. If you see them sharing this information, that's, sometimes easier said than done, depending on, if your father-in-law is really into Fox News or something like that. But, it's important that the information I'm sharing here doesn't just die here. The only way to fight fake news is to really spend time out and about talking to people about it and flagging it when you see it. So everyone has to do their part. And, I assume if you're at this Singularity thing, you're all smart people, and you're all responsible for the public good. And so, share this information, share this deck. Or if you see someone doing it, just say, hey, this isn't real. Just flag it. And if all else fails, remember those 5 tenets I shared with you at the beginning, and try to think like a journalist. Ask yourself, what would a journalist do here? There's some resources here. I won't go through all of them, but there are ways to make sure that you're not reading fake news through browser extensions, fact check sites, some tech platforms. There's a great Twitter list of journalists. The CUNY professor Jeff Jarvis that are covering COVID-19. So you should check that out. And of course, please check out Futurism and Singularity Hub for all of the greatest information and latest information on the current outbreak and a whole host of other things that will impact the future. And so with that, I have about 5 minutes left that we can go into questions. I do want to leave you, though, with a video that I saw on TV earlier today, just to remind everyone what the role of journalists are in a free society. It is to share information that is calming, that allows you to make better decisions because you understand the world that we live in, and it is available to give you that information. So we'll watch this, and then we'll dive into questions.
We don't have any audio, James.
Well, I got great audio.
That's good. It's good to know.
It sounds great to me.
Well,
I'm sorry. She's saying basically take a deep breath, calm down. It's a scary story. The world is scary, but we're here to, educate you and inform you so that you can calm down, breathe deep, and get on with whatever life looks like in the future.
And we will be sharing all of these links, or as many of them as we can, in the chat. And of course, they'll be on the resources page that we've been sharing along the way too. Thanks for all that, James. That was really thoughtful. I really appreciate that. Let's see what kind of questions we can get through in. Hey, Singularity team, I know you just shared the document. Can you share the web page? That's the most, that should be the most up-to-date one. That would be awesome. Okay, so first question. As an overseas New York Times subscriber and a Frenchman, I worry about the future of information freedom, at least in France. COVID-19 may be the start of a new era of press control. Do you have any similar concerns or signs in the US?
I think COVID-19 is so unprecedented for all of us. I think it's impossible to know if, governments want to declare martial law and say that you can't publish anything unless it's been run. I like to believe that the general public is more defensive of the press than perhaps I might otherwise give them credit. But it is a concern, and it's a free press doesn't just stay free because we want it to be. It's something that people fight for, people die for, keeping the press free in other countries. And so it's important to. Thank you for being a subscriber. Not that it goes in my pocket at all, but the more people who subscribe to news, the more we'll be able to keep news free and open. So, if there's a publication you like and there's a way for you to give them money, I guarantee you they can use it.
Fantastic. You got a shout out from LD Mark saying that they've shared this link with many journalists in the area. It needs much amplification. So you're doing something right, my man.
Amplify, no fake news. It's real. I love talking about this stuff, and journalists are they're an interesting bunch. I'm glad you're sharing it with them. I'm sure they will find 1,000 things that I did wrong in this conversation that they can flag me for. But thank you for sharing it.
Like any good journalist would, right?
Yeah, exactly. Skeptical.
All right, let's end on this one, and it's U.S. centric, but I think that it's probably accurate for any place that has free press, and that is. Stephen asks, back in December, January, February, we heard from mainstream media in the US, both saying that the coronavirus was not a big deal and that it was going to be very serious. When you get these conflicting stories, what can we do as readers and seekers of truth?
I think sometimes you need to acknowledge that, journalists they are not infallible. They don't always know the truth. We didn't know the truth in January. We had leading indicators that said that this was going to be a massive, massive deal. And then we had other indicators that said this is less, virulent than the flu. And so I don't think it's safe to expect all things the media say to be, a prediction of the future or hard and fast truth. It's still a business. They're still trying to drive attention and drive clicks and drive, tune in. And so being sensationalist is kind of part of the game to a certain degree, in both directions. But generally, if you find yourself in a time or in a story where information is conflicting itself, and these are legitimate publications kind of battling out the truth, that means the truth isn't set yet. And in the case of this story, we still don't know what this is. The worst is still yet to come from what we understand. And so, that truth is still yet to be revealed. But when it happens, I guarantee you'll read about it on Futurism, on Hub, and on all the other publications that are trying to cover this thing as best they can.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for joining us, James. I'm sure we'll do follow-up sessions with you as well. So appreciate you being here.
My pleasure, Adam. Good luck with the rest of the day. Thank you all for tuning in, and thanks for organizing this. I think this is super useful, and I have learned a lot in the last 3 days. I'm going back to my apartment. I'm going to hole up again. But go like and follow us. Futurism, Singularity Hub. We're great. Thanks, Adam.
There you go. Thanks, James. All right, that does us on the media topic. Coming up next, we have 3 really, really incredible women that are going to close out this virtual summit for us. If you haven't seen it already, over in the chat, we are trying to capture the other topics that you want to hear about, either related to COVID-19 or beyond COVID-19. So please go to that link, su.org/virtual-topics-poll. You can upvote the ones that you like, submit new ideas. We'd love to hear from you so we can build content that you'd love to see. And I will be going into that next session. Let me do a brief shout out to a couple things here to get my screen up and running. I mean, my big takeaway from that session for sure is we got to just keep doing our homework. And I know it would be so nice to think that we can trust. There's a trusted source somewhere and everything that comes out is going to be great. But I think where we ended on needing to be able to when we do see conflicting stories come out, just acknowledge that maybe the truth isn't there yet. People are still trying to figure it out. And at that point, use some of the earlier presenters' ideas and really take the time to model out what would you do in either scenario. If it was really, the worst case scenario, if it was the best case scenario, and be able to hold those polarities, which Catherine Brown's going to talk about here in a little bit. All right. We got these resources. They've already been posted into the chat, so I'll spare you on that one. Wanted to let you guys know that, excuse me, we've got another webinar coming up that's already scheduled on March 26th. So if you want to go deeper on how leaders can navigate chaos in uncertain times, another free session for you to join. We'll have our executive vice president of our enterprise offerings, as well as Jesse and Amanda, who work heavily with our large organizations. But this isn't just for organizations, it's for any individuals as well. And obviously, we're navigating a lot of chaos right now. So come and talk to us about it. You've got the link right down here, and the team will post that in the chat as well. And then, of course, another event coming up here in April, more great digital content for you. Visit exoworld.live/SU to join us. And with that, I'm going to wrap this up, go and take a quick break, and then we will come back to talk about, what are we talking about next anyways? Oh, how you can take action in times of uncertainty. So we'll keep that thread rolling, give you lots of action-packed tips, what you can go and do. So another workshop style session coming up to you next. See you soon.